Finally, welcome to the month of the beast. On What Magic Is This, everybody? I think many of you have been waiting for this month. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and my goodness, do we have a ton of things to get to on this show. So there's no time for fun and games. Let's jump right in and
smash the champagne bottle on the hull of the good ship Crowley Pop.
My guest today knows more about the man of the hour than perhaps anyone on earth. He is an academic and scholar, as well as the author of several books, including perhaps the greatest and most accessible single book for approaching the great beast, The Wiser, Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley. He is also the author of, without a doubt, the most comprehensive biography of Aleister Crowley of all time, Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley. I am deeply honored to be joined by Richard Kaczynski. Richard, thank you so much for being here.
Wow, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm honored by that as well.
Fantastic. Before we get into it, I have to ask, do you remember the very first time that you encountered Aleister Crowley by name or a picture? Do you recall the very first time that Aleister appeared in your life?
Oh, very, very vividly. I was about 14 years old when I had discovered the local metaphysical bookshop.
Okay.
And I was taking my bicycle up there, the 5 or 6 miles to the shop to check it out and spend my, 2 weeks worth of allowance I had saved up. And
right.
I had, in my first visit, bought the complete prophecies of Nostradamus, and then graduated very quickly from, on my next visit, to getting Israel Regardie's book, The Golden Dawn. And on that visit, the bookstore owner, for whatever reason, took a shine to me, and he said, "Hey, if you like, Israel Regardie's The Golden Dawn, you should check this out." And he pulled out the black Dover paperback edition of Magic and Theory and Practice, and that was my introduction to Crowley. And basically, I kind of read the first few pages, and I thought, I have no idea what the hell this means, but I'm damn well going to figure out. And I was off to the races from there.
Fantastic. So very easy, very simple first question, Richard. I have to ask, who on earth was Aleister Crowley?
Aleister Crowley was probably best known as a very influential polymath from the first half of the 20th century. And he is accomplished in areas including poetry, prose, books on magic. He's set records for mountain climbing and chalk cliff climbing. He was an accomplished chess player, ranked in college, and a fan all of his life. He could probably kick your ass in playing blindfold chess. And he was also a spy. But for the purposes of your listeners, he's probably best known as the occultist, the person who wrote books on magic, the founder of the worldview known as Thelema, and also as the guy who adopted the name, or who identified with the Great Beast as one of his various magical mottos.
Sure. Before we get really tucked into the life and the ideas of Aleister Crowley, which is truthfully the aim of this podcast episode, what is one thing that you think is important to know about Aleister Crowley as we move along the events and ideas of his life?
Oh, there's so many things, but if I had one thing, I think it would be this. Some people like to dismiss Crowley as a charlatan or a con man, and you see this happen a lot in the occult, and it's really kind of an intellectually lazy way of kind of dismissing someone that you really haven't looked into that deeply, or you just disagree with, perhaps. And I think it's important to start with this idea that Crowley was 100% sincere about his beliefs and his practices. He devoted his entire life to this pursuit of magic and promulgating his philosophy. And that was often to the detriment of his relationships, his friendships, and even his finances. But at no point did he ever waver in his belief in his mission as, the prophet of this new message for mankind. So whether you agree with him or not, there's no doubt that, he walked the walk until the day he died.
Sure. What can you tell us about the circumstances of Crowley's family, as well as a little bit about young Aleister, young Alec, I think is the name that he went by. A lot of people called him Alec, but because he was born into a somewhat rich family, was he not?
Yes, I think two of the things that really define his starting point are the fact that his family was part of a very fundamentalist religious sect called the Brethren, or more broadly known as the Plymouth Brethren. And they were, again, not only did they literally believe in the literal truth of the Bible, but they were also, of the opinion that Jesus was about to come back at any moment. And they were just waiting for this to happen. And they were also very austere, at least, this branch of the Brethren that Crowley and his family belonged to. They didn't celebrate Christmas because they thought it was a pagan holiday. The reading material that, young Alec was allowed to read was very proscribed and was mostly the Bible, and so on. So a lot of the sorts of distractions and pleasures that a young boy might partake in were not available to him. In addition to this, his family also had a great deal of wealth. His great-grandfather, that was the founder of Crowley's Ales. Essentially, they opened these ale houses where people on their lunch could go and they could get a sandwich and an ale and then get back to work. And they were very successful, and consequently, these ale houses kind of popped up all over England. And the family then invested in railways, because railways were an efficient way of moving product around and bringing people to your ale houses, and so on. And this money just kind of rolled over until it got to Crowley's, father's generation. And, being a religious man, he disinvested his holdings from the booze and invested in other things, waterworks and so on. But when Crowley reached his majority, reached 18, his father had died by that time. And his father, I should mention, was a lay preacher. So I'm getting really deep into religion. But when Crowley reached age 18, he inherited the equivalent of like $6 or $7 million.
Really? 6 or 7 million?
Yeah. And in today's, equivalent. And
wow.
And so he could pretty much do whatever he wanted to. And consequently, Crowley, although he worked as an editor and as a writer, he never had a regular job like we might think of as a regular job. I mean,
right.
He was able to live off of that money for a good. Well, he kind of burned through it pretty quickly, actually. But
before he was 30,
yeah. But then he kind of kept it together between writing and publishing odd bits here and there, and also by this point, he was also receiving donations from some of his followers, and then he also he had a trust fund that was set up when his mother died, and he and his daughter Lola received regular payments out of that the rest of his life as well. So in a lot of ways, Crowley was a trust fund kid.
Yeah. As a child, though, he seemed incredibly headstrong, and it was almost as if any boundary that was put up against him, he would immediately buck against it, or he would just disregard it. And why do you think that young Alec was like this? And why did Crowley remain like this till the end of his life?
I'd say the turning point in that was when his father died, because he very much admired and looked up to his father. And when his father, ironically enough, his father was a lay preacher. He actually walked around the country, distributing his own religious writings to whoever, would listen. He wound up dying of tongue cancer. So that's, a rich irony there. But that was really emotionally hard for Crowley to lose his idol. And when his mother tried to like take over the mailing list and sending out the pamphlets, or when his uncle tried to kind of step in the role of the family patriarch, Crowley resented the hell out of both of these things. It's like, you're not my dad. And so he starts acting up in school, and he winds up having these really bad experiences at these religious schools he's sent off to, where he's accused of things and is asked to confess, but no one will tell him what it is he's supposed to confess to. And he's he went through this long period where he was placed basically in solitary. He was able to go to classes and so on, but he couldn't interact outside of classes. And you live on campus, so he was kind of like restricted to his room, fed only bread and water until he confessed to whatever it was he supposedly did. And he wound up coming down with albuminuria, which was a life-threatening illness. And so he was pulled out of school, and at that point he had private tutors and basically went on a lot of rest cures around England, thinking that the fresh air would help him recover his health. And that was through that he discovered his love of climbing. But it's also kind of fed into this rebelliousness, because again, he suffered greatly at the hands of these so-called religious people who were looking after him. And so between his all of this, it really made him push back. And he once said, I did not hate God or Jesus. I simply hated the God or Jesus of the people I disliked, or words to that effect. And once the world opened up to him, and he discovered poetry and the finer things in life, sex and smoking and booze, and he came to realize just how much had been kept from him. And I think he recognized that this kind of hypocrisy ran deep throughout Victorian and Edwardian culture. And as you say, he kind of spent his whole life kind of pushing against that.
Just made a career out of it, for truthfully.
Yeah. And it kind of feeds into his idea that, okay, I am the harbinger of a new age. We're going to just chuck all that stuff and start over from scratch. Right. It all kind of ties in.
For sure. Crowley attended Cambridge. He wasn't the best student, although he wouldn't study for tests. He would just ace them. But it was while he was at Cambridge that he found and enjoyed writing poetry and playing chess. But as far as poetry was concerned, how important was it to Aleister?
Well, it was immensely, immensely important. I don't think you could understate how important poetry was. I mean, this is where he started. He didn't start writing books on magic. He started writing books of poetry. And by the time he was 30 years old, his collected works came out in a 3-volume set. So he was incredibly prolific. He was criticized initially as being, overly influenced by his heroes, Swinburne and folks like that. But he made efforts to kind of broaden that as well. A lot of his rituals include magic, include poetry, either poems that he wrote or poems that he admired from other people. And that's that idea that, why reinvent the wheel if someone has conveyed an idea in beautiful lyric terms? Grab it. I mean, that's kind of a tradition that, he learned from the Golden Dawn, who was, again, very, very prone to, grabbing quotes from existing literature. And he wrote poetry his entire life. And in fact, the very last book that he published in his lifetime was a book called Ola, with the subtitle, 60 years, celebration of 60 years of song. So it basically was just recognizing that, his poetic output from childhood to, when he died at age 72. So yes, immensely important.
He just called himself a poet all through his life. That was what he was mainly considered himself. It's quite beautiful. While he was in Cambridge, he also went on holiday in Stockholm as a young man, where Crowley had his first same-sex sexual experience. When the name Crowley gets brought up, the first thing a lot of people think about is sex and sex magic. But what is important for people to know about Crowley's sexuality and how sex played a role in his life?
Well, Crowley's sexuality, that's an easy one to address up front. And then that he was bisexual. And even though the majority of his sexual relationships were heterosexual, very early on, he had significant gay relationships, one with the female impersonator and actor Jerome Pollitt. Crowley, in one of his books, has a marginal note saying that for 6 months he lived with Pollitt as his wife, and then after he left Cambridge, a few years later, but he also developed a intense romantic relationship with one of his students, Victor Neuberg, with whom he did the Paris Working and the Vision, the Voice, and various other things. And both these relationships were tremendously important to him. The extent of Crowley's homosexual relationships is kind of hard to establish because it's not the sort of thing he could write about openly because. No. You go to prison. I mean, we had Oscar Wilde, before Crowley going to prison. Then you saw it, post Crowley, you saw it happen to Alan Turing. So, Crowley had to be very circumspect about that. But, you see it popping out in things like his book, The Scented Garden, which is kind of his poetic take on some of the, Arabic mystical and homoerotic sex writings. So it's a good piece there, but again, as I say, much of his romantic life was, with the opposite sex. But he was definitely bisexual, and he also played with, gender bending and things like that, and in his time at the Abbey of Thelema and so on. And sex was certainly a big factor in his life. I mean, you think of Crowley, as you say, you think of sex magic. And so for him, sex was never just about sex, but sex was always, it was a sacrament. It was a sacred act. It was a magical act. To the extent that every time he did have sex, I mean, there was an entry in his diary, and it wasn't just, I boned so-and-so today. Boy, was that great. But he would say, he would number these entries consecutively, and called opus such and such, and he would record his object. He, kind of details of the circumstances, and so on, to try and just kind of keep like lab notes, basically, of his experiments in sexual magic. And he continued to do this again throughout his entire life. So.
Would you go as far as to say that he might have been obsessed with sex, or was it just like one of those things? Do you think it was a major?
Who isn't? Yeah.
Well, true enough. Yeah, I mean, it's so strange that it's not strange, but just for his time, of course, he was seen as being
it's
very, very.
I suppose having come from this, very repressive childhood, it's. There's some things that are unsurprising. One, that he would have this focus on sex. Also that when you read some of like his mystical visions, they tend to take on this very, King James vibe. Of course, the Bible was the book that he read as a kid. That was like his own reading. So, when he's writing mystical stuff, it comes out in that way. I mean, these things, I guess, given where he came from, these sorts of details aren't that surprising.
For sure. Shortly after Crowley left Cambridge, he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which people think that he was like there for a very long period of time, but he was actually only a member for a little bit more than a year, I think. But how formative was his time with this? I'm just going to basically say it's the most infamous occult order of the last 150 years.
Yeah, it's impossible to understate or overstate, I should say. It's impossible to overstate how important the Golden Dawn was. Crowley, in his memoirs, kind of poo-poos the Golden Dawn. He says things like, "Oh, I got initiated, and they're going to reveal the great secrets, and the great secrets were the Hebrew alphabet," which anyone could, study. But that's really selling the Golden Dawn short. because the Hebrew alphabet basically forms the key to this whole system of correspondences they came up with, where those 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet map onto the 22 paths of the Kabbalistic tree of life. So you got these, 10 spherotes or centers representing the unfolding of creation and the 22 paths that connect them. And this forms a map not only of creation according to the traditional Kabbalah, but in Western esotericism, it becomes repurposed as this roadmap to attainment.
Yeah.
And the Golden Dawn integrates into this. They take, astrology from the Sephiroth Zera, but they also take, color symbolism, the tarot, and all sorts of things, and they build it into this amazingly coherent system. Yeah, you wouldn't think all the stuff would work together as well as it does, but if you really dig into it, it's really amazing how well this actually does work together. And this symbolic language forms the basis of Crowley's, ceremonial and ritual magic. I mean, you would not have Crowley's magic without that Golden Dawn at its foundation. As you say, Crowley was there just for just a couple of years. He happened to come into the Golden Dawn when it was going through a period of implosion, or it was splintering. And that's a long tale in of itself. But I guess without going into all the details, unless you want me to, I guess I would say that I've been seeing this, a lot of people lately seem enamored with this idea that William Butler Yeats yeeted Crowley down a flight of stairs. And
right.
That never happened.
No.
I think people just enjoy this wordplay of Yeats and yeet, but
yeah,
it was more just the British, raised voice and roasting, more than it was any sort of a physical altercation. We have an eyewitness account of, from one of the Golden Dawn members of what exactly happened.
Yeah.
It was really
he went and got the police. He went and got the police, and the police basically said, "Get a lawyer."
Exactly. So it's, it was not so much the Battle of Blythe Road as it would be, the Blabber of Blythe Road.
I love it. That's great.
People love a good story,
They do.
And that's part of the thing with Crowley. That these things tend to become larger than life, and with Rebel, I think part of my take was that Crowley's life is plenty interesting in reality, that we don't need to build it up to be something bigger than it really was.
Absolutely, 100% agree with you there, Richard. Now, Crowley had his first marriage to somebody it was a marriage of necessity, not for so much for Crowley, but for his wife. But he later came to really love this woman by the name of Rose Edith Kelly. But Rose is important for one major reason. She was part of perhaps the most important incident in Crowley's life. According to Crowley, what happened on their honeymoon in Cairo in 1904?
Well, the story kind of begins with them spending a night in the Great Pyramid in Giza, where Crowley had arranged, to be able to be there overnight. And part of what they did there, Crowley was demonstrating magic and did an invocation to the sylphs or something like that.
Right.
And this seemed to have some sort of effect on Rose's consciousness, or triggered something in her, because it was after this that she seemed kind of out of sorts, if you will, and started saying to Crowley that the gods were mad at him, or that the gods had a message for him. And Crowley regarded this with a deal of suspicion, kind of like, what are you talking about? And it also seemed kind of unusual because Rose, according to Crowley, was not someone who was very schooled in mythology or magic or whatnot. And so he decided to kind of, test whatever this is that she was communicating. And again, this is at a point where spiritualism, was a thing.
Right.
And the idea that Rose might be channeling something was not a completely, weird idea
No.
But she was able to answer the questions, and not only that, but when she said that the Egyptian god Horus, this concerned him. Crowley took her to a museum, asked her to point out an image of Horus, and she pointed to this kind of obscure funerary stele across the room, which happened to be stele number 666, which to Crowley was like bingo, and it did in fact include a depiction of Horus. So he finally took her seriously, and she started to say, well, here's the equinox of the gods is coming, so in the spring equinox, you need to do this ritual. Here's what you need to do. And then a couple of weeks later, it's like, okay, now at noon for the next 3 days, you're going to go into the study and, with a piece of paper and a pen, and you're going to hear a voice, and you're going to write down what you hear, for over the next hour. And it was in that, over those 3 days, that he wrote, or was the instrument of writing, or received, whichever verb you want to use for that, the manuscript of the Book of the Law, which was the holy book of Crowley's Thelemic worldview.
For sure. The voice came over, what was it, his left shoulder?
Yes.
Left shoulder, yeah. Very interesting stuff. Always. Now, the Book of the Law would be the central text of Crowley's Thelema, but he put it away for a little while. Like he wrote it all down, then he kind of chucked it aside for a little bit. It wasn't until he discovered it later, but it's a very interesting story. But I have to ask, because we've just brought up the term Thelema, and this is a bit of a doozy, Richard, but how would you explain Thelema to somebody who has never heard that word before?
Okay. Thelema is a Greek word, and there are various other pronunciations of it. So this is kind of an Americanized pronunciation of the Greek. I've had Greek professors tell me that it's more of an aspirated T, and the accent's on the first syllable, so it's more of a telema or something like that. But anyway, but the same professor also told me that no one actually speaks Greek with an aspirated T, like in the halls of academia. They just use the false sound because it's clear. But anyway, that being that as it may, Thelema, however you pronounce it, is Greek for will, and it corresponds to the central tenet of the Book of the Law, which is "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And that in and of itself is kind of prone to misinterpretation, because it does not mean do whatever you want. But what it really means is that it's kind of a modern day version of the old adage of know thyself. The idea is to dig deep, that we are programmed by society, by our environment, and so on. And it's to get underneath and past all that, and to try and understand the essence of who we are, and to live and act authentically. There's this idea in Crowley of the one true will, the idea that through this process of magic and meditation and reflection and the attainment of a holy guardian angel and all that, you find this, this purpose in life. And you could use that language if you prefer to the idea of being authentic to yourself. Right. But the idea is that once you figure out what your path is in life, that you focus all your energy on that to the exclusion of all else. Right. And that, Crowley explains is really kind of the meaning of do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Meaning that's all you're doing. There's a passage in the Book of the Law that also says thou hast no right but to do thy will. And so it's really a very, a disciplined sort of approach. Because you're always, the ideas are always keeping, the prize in mind, what you're trying, what the goal is. But by the same token, the kind of corollary is love is the law, love under will, which, again, in some of Crowley's writings, he says is, a call to be open to the experiences of this lifetime, to become a well-rounded individual.
Mm-hmm.
So while you're keeping your eye on the prize, is not necessarily, eschewing, life either. It's not being, an ascetic or anything like that necessarily, as we might conventionally think of the term, but just, be a whole person and be who you're meant to be, basically.
And the idea is that if everybody is following their wills, it's like almost the world becomes a better place in some way.
Yeah. And in fact, Crowley often says that one part of do what thou wilt means mind your own business. Because, what someone else's will is not your concern. And, it's and I think, in many ways, the world would be a much better place if people stopped worrying about what other people were doing with, whatever, with their clothes, with their genitals, with, who they love behind closed doors or anything. I mean, who cares? If it's not affecting you, then, leave it alone. Just mind your own business.
Love it. We don't have time to get into every single one of the wonderful details of Crowley's life. He bought a house on the banks of the Loch Ness. He was mountain climbing. He climbed K2, and he also climbed Kaczynski. What is it?
Kaczynski.
Yeah, but I want to talk a little bit about Crowley's personality, because it's a hard one to nail down. If you read a lot of biographies, if you read your biography, at some points, Aleister Crowley could be incredibly kind and generous to his friends and to even people that he just met. And at other points, he could be almost sadistically cruel, like failing to help other climbers when they were hit by an avalanche. Do you think that Crowley displayed traits that were akin to psychopathy at all? Like, do you think he was a sociopath in some way? I mean, it's such a strange back and forth as far as the events that he talks about in his life and how other people talk about him as well.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as a trained psychologist myself, I would say that a psychologist would never diagnose someone without actually having the opportunity to sit down and speak with them.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't trust, these, secondhand or anecdotal accounts, and without being able to ask, it's really impossible to come up with a diagnosis.
Right.
That being said, Crowley, I don't know. I don't feel like I see signs of psychosis. I mean, there are people who've tried to push that. Some people have tried to push the idea that he was neurodivergent and various other things. And it's impossible to know. There's a brain disorder that can happen that causes people to write compulsively.
Right.
And I confess there's a point where I pondered whether that might be the case for Crowley, just because it's the amount of stuff this man wrote is just ridiculous. I mean,
Puritan work ethic. He just worked all the time.
Yeah, but he wrote Diary of a Drug Fiend in less than a month. He was constantly corresponding. I mean, the guy would write like dozens of letters a day, and it's incredible. But, again, looking into physiologically what's involved in that condition, I mean, I don't really believe that was the case.
Right.
But I think one of the things that makes Crowley an interesting person, particularly if you're coming at him as a prophet of a new age, or even as a spiritual teacher, to kind of tone, to use a slightly more approachable language. You think about the great religious teachers of history. You think of like Jesus and Buddha and folks like this, and the depictions of Jesus are these perfect, virtuous beings. And how do you identify with that? But
right.
Crowley, I mean, he was just a guy. I mean, he fucked up. He had lousy relationships. He could be really nice and generous, but he could also be a dick, and that's a person that we can all relate to, because those are true of all of us, and in writing his biography, I guess I was always aware of the fact that if you took anyone's life, and because Crowley wrote everything in his diaries and his letters, I mean, it's all there to see. And you look at anyone's life over 72 years, and there's going to be times where anyone is embarrassed about something, or they did something they shouldn't have. And, we just had the luxury of being able to poke at Crowley more because he was pretty transparent about it all.
Yeah, for sure.
That also kind of makes him a more approachable, not role model. That's not quite the right word, but it's just like, wow, if Crowley could attain, then I can too.
Right. Somebody that you mentioned earlier, Victor Neuburg, Aleister Crowley and him, they went to Algeria in 1909, and they evoked the 30 Aethers. And if people aren't aware what that is, I mentioned it briefly on my John Dee episode, but why did Crowley consider this one of the finest and most profound magical rituals of his life?
Well, I think the simplest answer of this is that this series of invocations of the 30 ethers of kid magic represented the culmination of his initiation into the third order, the top tier of 3 grades in the magical system, based on the Golden Dawn's Tree of Life model.
Right.
And while he had gone through a lot of the ordeals prior to doing these visions, Crowley very much thought that when his daughter Lilith died of typhoid, that this was part of this ordeal for him, this kind of test of like, will your resolve persist even in the face of like the worst possible human tragedy? And that was a few years earlier, but this kind of like made it official, kind of dotted the T's and or dotted the I's and crossed the T's or whatever, and kind of encapsulated this journey from his grade of exempt adept through the abyss to the grade of master of the temple, and so this was a very, very significant initiation for him. So it wasn't just a series of visions, but it was actually an initiation.
Yeah. There was one thing that people really make a big deal of is this demon Tronzon.
Tronzon.
Yeah, and that Crowley at one point he attacked. Either he attacked or this demon attacked Victor Neuburg at one point. It's actually really incredible reading for people if they actually want to look it up. But it seemed specifically for somebody that you mentioned earlier, Israel Regardie, who wrote a biography called The Eye in the Triangle. His biography actually stops after that event because he said that Crowley was not the same man after this. What do you have anything to pitch with this? Because it's such a strange thing that Regardie would just stop his biography there.
Well, again, it's been a while since I've read The Eye in the Triangle, but that seems kind of odd because Regardie did not meet Crowley until 20 years after that.
Right.
So how could Regardie say he wasn't the same man afterwards? And again, this is part of this myth making that a lot of people like to engage in. There's like a fictionalized version of Crowley being possessed by a demon in Paris and killing Neuburg or somebody else.
Right.
And that he was possessed ever since, and was
and break glasses of water just by looking at them. That's one of my favorite ones.
And when you read the account of the 10th Ether, it's not exactly clear whether this is literally Crowley attacking Neuburg or if this is Neuburg's vision, because the vision also has what Neuburg is seeing changing shape and morphing into other people. So it's so clearly Crowley was not morphing into other people. There's more going on here. One researcher into Crowley who was particularly interested in the subject of Crowley's exploration of psychedelics, proposes that this may have played a role in some of the vision of the voice workings as well. And if that's the case, that could also explain some of what's recorded there.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of speculative. We don't know
Right.
for sure, but it's kind of an interesting angle to look at it from.
Yeah, definitely. If one comes up into contact with any part of Crowley's story, the words Scarlet Woman will no doubt come up. What were Crowley's Scarlet Women, and what role did they play in his life?
Well, the role of Scarlet Women has a lot of parts to it. In some ways, it's Crowley's magical partner, not just sex magical partner, but also partner in the great work of promulgating, the message of Thelema. In many cases, people who he identified as his Scarlet Women played the role of initiatrix, that they were fundamental in either initiations or, again, profound moments in his magical life, such as receiving the Book of the Law through the agency of Rose Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Without Rose Kelly, there would be no Book of the Law, there would be no Thelema. And similarly, at the Abbey of Thelema in the 1920s, so this was like 16 years after the Book of the Law, is Scarlet Woman at that time, Leah Herzig, was the person who was witness to his initiation into the degree of abscissinus, the highest possible grade on this Tree of Life model. And also to the extent to which, there's a sort of gender polarity at work, part of the symbolism of the Book of the Law and Crowley's sex magic is this idea of the universe as a whole kind of becoming separated into separate bits. Mm-hmm. This idea that I am divided for love's sake, for the chance of union. And so the idea that sexual union really is kind of the experience of this divine unity of the whole universe. And so you tend to see this sort of sexual polarity imagery running through a lot of Crowley's writing. And if Crowley represents kind of the masculine end of that polarity, the great beast, then Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, is the other end of that polarity.
Right. Babylon, that's one that a lot of people. Could you? I know it's so tough. Could you explain what Babylon meant to Aleister Crowley?
Oh, I'll do my best. It's a tough one.
It is
to summarize. But Crowley's favorite book of the Bible as a kid was Revelation.
Hell yeah!
Which discusses the horror of Babylon. Who rides upon the beast. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of terrified and fascinated with this. And his mother, when she was exasperated with young Alec, would often say, "Oh, you're the beast of Revelation." And so he wound up adopting that name gladly, and he winds up repurposing. Basically the whole symbolism of Revelation, because the traditional Christian interpretation of Revelation is that the beast and the horror of Babylon represent these infernal forces that are part of the tribulations that visit mankind before the second coming of Jesus. In Crowley's mind, though, he kind of interprets this as the Book of Revelation is symbolic of the new eon, the new age, the next thing that comes along, just as Christianity follows Judaism and so on, that the beast and Babylon represent what comes next. And of course, that's terrifying if you're, an early Christian, is to say this new thing that you can't understand is going to come along. And there's a magical basis for thinking of this. The Plymouth Brethren themselves have this idea of dispensationalism, that history moves through these epochs that are handed down by God, and that tied in kind of neatly with this idea of Isis, Apophis, and Osiris, or I'm sorry, I'm kind of confusing my terminology. It was not so much Isis, Apophis, Osiris, but this idea of the precession of the equinox, that we had this eon of Isis that was very goddess-oriented and earth-oriented and matriarchal. Then we move to the Aeon of Osiris, which is very much concerned with the slain and resurrected god or fertility gods and things like that. And then we get to the Aeon of Horus in the present day. So all that said, Crowley also ends up repurposing not only the beast, which is for him a symbol of the sun, nothing more than that. Well, I shouldn't say nothing more, but that's kind of the key of it. The core of it is the sun. He also repurposes Babylon, and rather than being, the whore that fornicates with all the kings of the earth and blah blah blah, she represents the idea of the modern, liberated, and empowered woman. Right. If you look at a lot of the people that Crowley was attracted to, they were not the stay-at-home wife type. The idea that women could have careers or be educated was still kind of, a new thing in Crowley's time. But he was attracted to people who bucked convention just like him, and they were bohemians, they were artists, they were writers, they were people who were, again, pushing the envelope. Yeah. And I'm not even doing this justice. There's just so much more.
There's too much.
One thing I would really recommend is there is a book by Manon Hedenborg White called The Eloquent Blood, which came out a year or two ago from Oxford University Press. And she does a great job of analyzing Babylon, not only from the biblical roots and within Crowley's system of magic, but also how the idea of Babylon has evolved, under the embrace of modern day practitioners. And, again, it's a really big subject, and that I couldn't think of a better book for people to read than that one. I mean, it's academic, but it's worth the read. That absolutely.
Fantastic. I'll be up in the show notes. Two things that people will bump up against also when engaging with Crowley are two organizations, the AA and the OTO. What are these organizations?
All right. Well, the AA you can think of as being one of the various successor groups. When the Golden Dawn blew up, various subgroups of members went off and tried to restart it or continue it or improve upon it. And AA is very much Crowley's attempt to improve upon the Golden Dawn model. So it uses the same grade system, basically. But Crowley just kind of beefs it up with more reading material, more tests, more magical practices as well. Crowley laments that a lot of the magical work in the Golden Dawn doesn't happen until you get to the second or inner order, as it's called.
Right.
And he's got people doing magic, from the very beginning. And again, that's not entirely fair of the Golden Dawn, but it is fair to say that Crowley's revisioning of that model is more advanced, I would say, or packs in more. I don't want to say advanced because I don't want to be dissing the Golden Dawn, because a lot of people still love that model and it's a great system, but Crowley just crammed a lot more into that in his version of it. And if the AA is Crowley's Golden Dawn on steroids, then the OTO is kind of Crowley's attempt to do the same thing with Freemasonry. And so if the AA is kind of focused on individual magical work, the OTO is more of a group and social organization where people, again, they can support each other in their interests and their studies. And the ceremonies of OTO, the initiation ceremonies, are geared to try to teach people just principles of Thelema and how, with each degree, kind of just here's how you can apply this in your daily life. Which is not to say that OTO is not concerned with magic, but it's the more group and social aspect of it, whereas AA is more, solitary.
The AA, what does it stand for? Do we even know?
A lot of opinions about that. Conventionally, it's, people take it to be some version that means silver star, like whether it be in Greek, astra and argon, or in Latin, argentium astrum, or something like that. But the idea is that it is simply the AA, and its meaning is actually only revealed to aspirants of the order. So
got it.
We can only speculate.
Ah, gosh, mysterious. These organizations engaged in Crowley's magic. What does Thelemic magic look like? And are there any universal aims in Thelemic magic? And also, got to put this in there, how does sex magic enter into it?
Okay. Now, the question of Thelemic magic is kind of interesting because Crowley certainly wrote a lot of rituals.
Yep.
But if you look at some of them, a lot of them seem to just be kind of tweaks or reimaginations of existing rituals. So you might see something like Crowley has a ritual called the Star Ruby, which you could say is kind of sort of Crowley's version of, or a Thelemic version of, the more traditional lesser banishing ritual. And you can look at this and so you can see kind of Crowley reinventing rituals by kind of using these models and structures of previous rituals. And that's something that Crowley had a real gift for. His Gnostic Mass does that with kind of a traditional Mass-like formula, and his OTO ceremonies kind of do the same thing with traditional, the Masonic type form, but then, he transmogrifies them into something that is uniquely his. But Crowley at the end of his life, writes this really interesting letter to one of his acolytes or colleagues, depending on how you look at it, William Bernard Crowe, saying that the mechanics of the new eon, or of Thelemic magic, if you will, really need to be worked out. Crowley even admits that for most purposes, he's still using the formulas of the old eon, the eon of Osiris. And he says that they still work, but it's going to take someone, who was born in this eon, who doesn't have that baggage of the old eon to actually work it all out. So even though Crowley has left us with, a lot of rituals to work with, he also, at the end of his life, acknowledged that, it needs to be, someone's going to have to figure it all out. We're still, 60, 70 years later after he wrote that. And, it's still a work in progress, I would say.
Right.
As far as the sex part goes, some of Crowley's rituals can be read as incorporating magic or sex into them. And that's not the case for all of them. And there's some people who might be interested in approaching like AA or OTO might be concerned or curious about that, or even
right.
In none of those initiations is anyone required to engage in any kind of sexual activity. You may receive instructions at some point that you can use in your own private practice. Right. I remember Juan Duquette, one of our great living writers on magic and Palema, saying that if you wind up having sex with someone in an OTO, it is because of your personal charms, not because of anything that you were required or taught to do.
Right.
But very much the case with Crowley was that he actually went through this transition where after, quite a number of years of working this sort of ceremonial magic tradition, and then at some points involving sex in the ceremony, he ultimately reached this point where sex was the ritual, and the necessity for robes and regalia and all this other stuff kind of goes away, and you can do the magic with just, two human bodies, or more than two, I imagine. But the idea being that all the trappings of ceremonial magic, he kind of had enough experience that he could move beyond that. Those externalized symbols, those things that those tools represent. Again, as I mentioned earlier, he considered every act of sex that he had in his lifetime to be a magical act, and he kind of compared this to, if you don't do this, it's kind of like walking into a room with a gun, and just shooting it at random, and who knows who or what you're going to hit. So he said, if you're going to do this, you better have a target in mind, and that's kind of his idea with sex. It's like you're raising and discharging energy, so know what you're doing with it.
For sure. Perhaps the peak of Crowley as a spiritual leader was when he had an abbey of Thelema in Sicily. Why? A lot of people make a big deal out of this for fairly appropriate reasons, but why did this turn out to be one of the most pivotal points in his life?
Well, it was his opportunity to put these ideas, particularly these social ideas of Thelema, into practice, to create kind of an abbey or a religious community, to see what that would be like. I mean, not in theory. He had run the AA. He had run the British section of OTO. He was, again, at this point in his life, still just the national leader for the UK of OTO. Not yet the worldwide leader, but these were, groups that came together. OTO was, you'd come together for ritually and kind of go away. But this is, what would an actual community of Thelemites look like? And this is his attempt to do that. And he test drove a lot of ideas. And one idea that was kind of interesting is this idea of, this is my word, not his, but defascination, I suppose. That there's this chamber of nightmares that he painted, which had just these really sexually explicit frescoes and horrible images and stuff. And part of his thinking here was that you see these naked people and giant phalluses and so on. Kind of like there's akin to the frescoes of Pompeii or something. That if you're surrounded by this all the time, your fascination and its power over you is kind of be dissipated. And he kind of had a similar idea with having controlled substances available. It's just like, if it's here, you want it, go ahead. And the idea that these things will lose their power and fascination. And I don't know, I kind of have a personal anecdote along those lines, because I was in grade school before before DARE was a thing.
Got it.
And my brother-in-law was much older brother-in-law was a police officer, and I remember he would bring home these pamphlets about what are drugs and things like this, and I thought this was fascinating, and I remember ooh, I'm going to make a diorama of a heroin kit. So I stole my mom's spoons and some sugar cubes and my dad's lighters, and so I had this shoebox under my bed that was basically
oh my
God, heroin kit. But for me it was just familiar. Again, this is single digits. I'm a child doing this, but it was just my intellectual curiosity, but with the result being that later on in life, it's like I knew what this stuff was. I was familiar with it, and I didn't have quite the same sort of fascination with it that some of my peers did. So I think, in a way, Crowley kind of had a point there. That I guess there's also one of my favorite lines in The Simpsons. This is when Bart and it's Ralph snooping around in Chief Wiggum's room, and he catches them and he says, "Why are you so fascinated with the forbidden closet of mystery?" And I think that's the answer. It's because it's the forbidden closet of mystery.
Right.
Once the mystery goes away, it's like, yeah.
It was while in Sicily, there's the talk of, there was kind of like a free love commune. There's stories of them engaging in sex acts in front of their children. At one point, a member of this brings his wife. Wife's not happy with the place, and then he drinks from a stream and he eventually
dies, his wife goes back and goes to the tabloids. And Crowley had been in the tabloids before. This wasn't his first rodeo with the tabloids, but this was one of the ones where death at the Abbey of Thelema, and things did not go. So how bad was the fallout from basically being kicked out from the Abbey on Sicily?
It was a moment that haunted him the rest of his life. I mean, not just the death of a student that he was very fond of and he had a lot of hopes for, but also just the attack from the tabloids. It was at this point that one of the headlines labeled him the wickedest man in the world, and that was something that that was a title that he never shed. No. And certainly, if you think of a world where you've got Mussolini and Hitler running loose, I mean, Crowley was not even in the same ballpark. It's really kind of ridiculous. How right. The hyperbole there, but it really hurt him. And contrary to popular belief, again, the people who consider Crowley to be kind of this, publicity hound. He did not like this negative publicity. I mean, he was basically stuck in Chafaloo. He had burnt through his money long ago, and he did not see any way that he could get back to England and afford to hire a lawyer to sue a very wealthy newspaper publisher, who could spend all the money in the world, that he wanted to defend himself. Mm-hmm. He just thought there was just no way he could respond to this. He was frustrated. I mean, Norman Mudd, one of his other students there at the Abbey, transcribed Crowley's complaints about this. We have Crowley's objections to the articles. He was not happy about this at all. It was not a case of any publicity is good publicity. No. And he found it very hard. There are a series of articles and poems, about 5, I believe, that appeared in the English Review at this time. And a friend of his, Frank Harris, was the editor at the time. I believe it was Frank Harris. But anyway, he knew the editor, and while they were willing to help him out and publish his pieces, he had to publish them under pseudonyms because they just, at this time, Crowley was under such strenuous attack from the tabloids, they just couldn't run things with his real name on them. Dutton, meanwhile, did contract him to write Diary of a Drug Fiend, however. Right. So
went to Tunisia for a little bit, pops over to Berlin. And this, I have to ask, because this is a bit of a diversion, but as the years roll by, more and more people are starting to promulgate that Crowley was a spy. How much water does this speculation hold? Was it actually, there's a book, Secret Agent 666, and other biographers have said that he probably was doing some spying, at least at one point in his life. What do you make of this?
Yeah, no, I don't think this is so much a new thing, because going back to my first edition of Perturabo, I back in 2002, I touch on this as well. I think it's just something that people are getting to pick up on.
Yeah.
Kind of the idea was that I think kind of the most famous incident here is that during World War I, Crowley came to America and he ingratiated himself into German propaganda circles. And this included a fellow by the name of George Sylvester Viereck, who was a New York publisher of 2 magazines. One was called The International, which was just kind of a general interest magazine, but another one was called The Fatherland, which was, again, basically a German propaganda magazine. And the goal here wasn't so much to bring America in on Germany's side into the war, but just to, it's kind of like, the climate change disinformation today. It's just to create enough disinformation so that there is doubt. The idea was to keep American opinion uncertain and to delay or America's entry or to keep them out of the war altogether. And it's this group that Crowley becomes part of, and he eventually becomes actually editor of the International, but he's also a regular contributor to the Fatherland. And this causes a lot of trouble back home because the police wind up raiding and shutting down the OTO Lodge in London, kind of as retribution for what they saw as betrayal of the country. And Crowley would explain that his intent was to write propaganda that was just so ridiculous that it would embarrass the Germans, make them look stupid, and actually work against them. Critics and skeptics of this have said that basically, he was just a kind of a turncoat, and when he turned out that he backed the wrong course, he tried to backpedal. But that does not seem to be the case. There's plenty of evidence that was not the case. In his diary, when America breaks off diplomatic relations and prepares to enter the war, Crowley in his diary writes, "At last, my 2.5 years work, has achieved success." We know that he was reporting to Admiral Guy Gaunt, who is the naval attaché in the UK, stationed in New York. At the time, there were a number of people who was telling that he was working as an intelligence agent, and these letters survive. He was interviewed by the FBI, and no charges were pressed. He returned to England, no charges were pressed. So if he was a traitor, these would not be the case. And in World War II, he was again approached by the intelligence services with ideas for, potentially acting as bait to attract, one of the Nazi masterminds who was also into astrology to secretly travel to England to have Crowley do his horoscope. They decided that Crowley was a little too well known for that gambit. But Crowley lived in Berlin during the 30s, and he was spying on his roommate Gerald Hamilton, and we know he was reporting to intelligence services there. So, you look at his life, and throughout his life, he just seemed to be connected. He just seemed to always be around military people. Whether it was, this, Commander Marston, who inspired him to do the Rites of Lucius. JFC Fuller was a military guy. He just throughout his life. And in the 40s, he was buddies with another eccentric who again, we know was also a British spy. So it's, there's a lot of evidence out there that he was in fact, an intelligence agent. And, the thing is, secret society, secret agents or agencies do not tell you who their agents are. That's right. But I would say anyone who's really interested in this topic should check out Richard Spence's book, Secret Agent 666, which you mentioned, because the whole book is kind of devoted to that topic.
Absolutely. 3 constants in Crowley's life were travel, sex, and drugs. How large of a role did the latter of these play in the life of the great beast?
Well, I'd say the question of drugs is kind of a 2-part answer. And I say this because the role of drugs is another one of these things that has been kind of exaggerated to mythic proportions. So the first part is that Crowley, yes, he was. He experimented. He was an experimenter with drugs, and particularly entheogens, psychedelics. He claimed to be the person to introduce peyote to Europe, and that may not be true, but he certainly was an early proponent of its use. The story goes that when he did his Rites of Lucius, they basically had dosed the audience with peyote tea, or at least in the initial private, version of it. But it also needs to be remembered that it was not until 1922, 1923. So this is kind of fast forwarding to the Chafaloo period, where both the US and the UK passed some version of the Dangerous Drug Act, which makes these substances illegal. So in Crowley's time of experimentation, these are things you could just go to your chemist shop and buy. I mean, they were not controlled substances at all. And this is kind of in the same category as, Sigmund Freud, encouraged his mistress to take cocaine because he liked how it made her complexion more flush. And he thought that was more attractive. You put cocaine in Coca-Cola, that was the world at that time. And oddly enough, when Crowley came to the United States at the beginning of World War I, he actually went to the Park Davis Pharmaceutical Laboratories in Detroit, and they actually prepared, peyote pills to his specification for his experiments. And he actually kept a record of these experiments in a record that he called the Cactus. And unfortunately, that is lost. That's one of Crowley's lost works, which is too bad. So I'd love to see what was in it and what he made of it. But yes, he was definitely an entheogenic explorer. Part two of this was that after Crowley returned to England after World War I, he began suffering really severe asthma. And this apparently is something that's pretty common for mountaineers, being at these high altitudes, thin oxygen, it's hard on the lungs. But regardless of the cause, he developed severe asthma, and his physician at that time, again, pre-Dangerous Drug Act, prescribed heroin as an analgesic, and it did in fact help him breathe. The result of this is that Crowley wound up addicted to heroin, and this is a problem for him when the Dangerous Drug Act was passed. And also he's, in Chafaloo, and he's basically trying to buy from a dealer, and then he runs out of money and basically is forced to quit cold turkey.
Yeah.
And he does. And you don't really see reference to Crowley taking drugs either for his asthma or, really for magical purposes after that. Until he's like 68, thereabouts, where, again, he's got this other kind of asthma medication he's taking, and it just stops being effective. And now by this time, this is, God, I'm trying to think what year, about 1941, 1942. So it's like 20 years later.
Right.
England kind of recognizes that heroin can actually be used for medical purposes, but in very controlled and carefully administered dosages. And his doctor, once again, puts him on heroin. And there's this diary entry where he says, wow, I've taken, this first dose of heroin, and I'm quite loopy. Since the first time in 20 years. And so he winds up on this medically controlled regimen of heroin through his, his end years. Again, he died at 72. So he was, on this regimen for, 4 or 5 years, something like that. So the reason I kind of go into detail on this is there's just this vision, or this version of Crowley as being this lifelong drug fiend, and it's not true. He did go through a period of intense magical exploration.
Right.
That was a period in his life, and there were 2 periods, once in his 40s and once in his 60s, 70s, where he was using heroin, but that was medicinal. He was also, during Chafaloo, he was also, he went through a period, he was also addicted not just to heroin, but cocaine. And he actually keeps a journal called The Fountain of Hyacinth, where he tracks his abilities to kind of assert his will, in the magic with a capital W over his addiction.
Right.
He considers it a success. I'm not quite as convinced reading this, but be that as it may, when Crowley runs out of cash, a year or two later, I mean, he winds up going cold turkey, whether he likes it or not. So, the Crowley as the lifelong drug fiend story is one that's been, again, exaggerated.
Yeah. He was addicted to heroin, though, right up to the end of his life, though, was he not?
Yes.
Yeah. The final years of Crowley's life they're somewhat incredibly fascinating because he seems to attempt to solidify his magical stance, and he becomes incredibly prolific. And he's already prolific, but he becomes very, very prolific. But which of the Twilight works of Crowley do you feel is essential to understand the man and his work?
Oh, so many great things he wrote. They kind of run the gamut from, approachable to kind of something you need to spend a lot of time with.
Right.
But I think something that kind of accounts for this outpouring of writing is that, Crowley did feel that publishers didn't want to touch him after the whole Chafaloo thing and all those tabloid attacks. And, it took him a while to kind of recover from that. But in terms of his later writings, I think I would start in my list of what I think is remarkable with 8 lectures on yoga.
Okay.
Crowley has this reputation, and I think an ill-deserved reputation, for being cryptic and incomprehensible. And that can be true for certain writings.
Right.
It's like Magic and Theory and Practice, as I said at the beginning. I read the first few pages and I was like, what the hell is this? But this was written for, with the goal that this was going to be read by his students who would have access to other materials that he was circulating. And he's also kind of self-referential. So he's often referring to all these things I published in the Equinox, 20 years ago, so you go back and look at that. And once you've read the material, you have access to it, all makes sense.
Right.
But again, but Crowley's like that when he's writing for his students. Mm-hmm. And I think 8 lectures on yoga shows that Crowley could sit down and write about a complicated topic in a very simple language. Right. And I think for that, 8 lectures on yoga is brilliant. I mean, it's just this accessible, easy and concise work that deals with the practice of yoga. On the other extreme, you've got his Book of Thoth, which is not only an explication of the tarot or the tarot project that he and Frida Lady Harris, did to reinvent the tarot, but really in many ways it's kind of Crowley's final distillation of his magical thinking. He wrote this again after 40 plus years of magical work and reflection and contemplation, and this is him putting it all together. So you can kind of go back to the Book of Lies from 1913. You can go back to the Equinox, and even Magic and Theory and Practice. Parts of that were written during his World War I period. Right. So compared to the Book of Thoth, those are, I don't want to use the word primitive, but they were not as thought out. And the Book of Thoth kind of shows Crowley looking back and thinking about putting all this together, into his grand unified theory.
It's very crystallized, the Book of Thoth. Yeah, it's wonderful.
So I guess so those are probably like the two, for me, the two pinnacles. I mean, there's other great works he wrote at that time, of course, but those are the standouts for me.
Love it. Crowley didn't have a very good World War II. He was in London for the largest part of World War II, was he not?
He was in London for part of it, but the Blitz got to be so bad that doctors recommended that he kind of move outside of the city. So he was, in the boroughs, the greater London area.
For sure. He ended his life basically at a boarding house in Hastings called Netherwood. There's some interesting stories of Crowley there, but
Much of the story of Crowley's influence comes from after his death in 1947. How do you think that it was for Crowley that he was able to maintain some kind of stature and influence after he passed away?
There's a variety of answers to that. One is that he had some very dedicated students, his successor, and friends who thought that Crowley had something valuable to say and thought it was vitally important to preserve his literary legacy. One of these people was Gerald York, who was briefly a student of his, but ultimately decided that he couldn't accept Crowley's philosophy 100%, and therefore he thought it was like intellectually dishonest to be a student. So he kind of stepped back from that role, but he continued to believe that Crowley had something valuable to say, and his work was worth preserving after Crowley. And in Crowley's lifetime, he would often pay for typists to type up Crowley's works with the understanding of agreement that, hey, I'll pay for this typist, but I want to keep the manuscript. And after Crowley died, he and Crowley's successor, Karl Germer, were just kind of tireless and just tracking down all the people that Crowley knew and following up leads to try to find his diaries, his letters, get copies of his letters. Kenneth Grant, when Crowley's, secretary toward the end of his life, transcribed a bunch of this stuff. And they were like swapping copies with other collectors and stuff just to make sure there were multiple copies of this material so that it could not be lost to the ages.
Right.
So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is John Simons wrote this really this sort of potboiler biography of Crowley called The Great Beast.
Right.
And in many ways, Crowley's friends, thought this was just a total hit job, and just eviscerated Crowley. But in some ways, that evisceration kind of made Crowley an object of some fascination as well. So for better or worse, that book kind of kept Crowley's legend alive, the myth alive, if nothing else. And so, you find all these, particularly it's kind of fun, like in the 50s and 60s, there's like all these men's magazines. It's not just like Penthouse, which was certainly ran articles on Crowley, but like True and things like that, these rough man magazines or these slightly titillating but not really dirty magazines. They just loved writing stories about Crowley and his dirty, naughty, filthy sex rituals with naked women and this and that, and so it just became a way to sell magazines. Mm-hmm. And then you come into the 60s, and Crowley's embrace of alternative spiritualities, his interest in drugs played into the drug culture, and just his whole idea of liberation and free sex and free love, was very much tied into that ethos of the 60s. And I think all those things all in combination kind of carried things forward. It's kind of interesting, though, I'm reminded, just kind of circling back to Gerald York, that even though he had stepped away from being a student of Crowley's, in one of his letters, he does confess that he has kept an Abramelin talisman, Abramelin being one of these magical grimoires, but he kept an Abramelin talisman for finding books. And he attributed that to his success in building this massive archive of Crowley's works, which is currently housed at the Warburg Institute in London.
For sure.
And, it was because of that collection that everyone from Simons to myself have been able to write, these books on Crowley, because that material has been preserved.
100%. Yeah. As a Thelemite yourself, what is it about Thelema that resonates the most with you?
That for me, that's kind of a chicken and the egg question sometimes.
Okay.
I wonder, because I think my answer is that one of the cool things about magic, as Crowley teaches it, is the idea of Thelema as kind of a a very disciplined approach, the idea of find your will and do it to the exclusion of all other distractions, is very powerful, and those are skills and abilities that transfer to other areas of life. I mean, I got a PhD in psychology, and if you're going to do a dissertation, you've got to have those skills to do that.
Right.
You got to focus on that, and get that done. And so, in some ways, I think my experience in those sorts of disciplines of yoga and magic and concentration and all of that was helpful. But then again, I was always kind of a studious and disciplined kid from a very young age. I knew from second grade I wanted to be a writer. So it's not like I, discovered my true will through, the magic stuff exactly. That may have helped kind of focus what I did with my writing, but I kind of wonder sometimes, did the magic teach me to be disciplined, or did this disciplined child find himself drawn to magic and Thelema because it suited his personality?
Right.
But I suspect it's perhaps a little bit of both. But
sure.
But it's an idea that makes sense. I mean, you often think about these stories of, I don't know, athletes and celebrities and other people who have made it. And oftentimes you hear their stories about, I was living in the back of, a station wagon until I got my break and all of this. And that kind of shows this, dedication to, being who you want to be, and then of course, for every, celebrity that makes it big, there are people who are still trying to make it. But then again, I would argue that being authentic to yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you make it big or that you become famous. It just means that you become satisfied. You become, again, who you want to be. You become your ideal self.
I love it. That's great. Yeah. What do you think is the continued appeal of Crowley and Thelema to this day? Because Crowley has never gone away. Like he's always been around.
Yeah. Again, I think people are getting a better understanding or a better handle on Crowley. A lot of the biographies that were written about Crowley, again, from Simon's on down, could tend to be of the more sensational variety. But in the tier of the 21st century, which still seems weird for me to say, but Crowley has actually been reappraised in serious academic research, and his influence, not just in occultism, but in art and literature and in other areas in philosophy, are being acknowledged. And people are taking what he says more seriously, or his legacy more seriously. And I think that in of itself is contributing a great deal to his continued relevance today.
Huh. Yeah, there's also been a bit of a reassessment of not just Crowley, but of Thelema itself recently. Do you think that this is warranted? And do you think that change is needed somehow amongst Thelemites and Thelemic orders? Because there's a lot of people are looking inward right now as far as Thelema is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to be able to step back and kind of take a look and reflect and see where to go next, see how to, be better, to do these things better. Again, earlier we were talking about what does Thelemic magic look like, and there's still this kind of need to work out the details of
right.
that. But also, there's this idea that Crowley was very much a product of his times, and he was, as you point out, in constant rebellion against the mores and the religion of his time. So a lot of what he's doing is kind of a reaction to the prevalence of Christianity and its role in society and in many parts of the world right now. I mean, we live in a more secular time, and that influence is still there, but not quite in the same way as it was in Crowley's time. And so how does, what does the Lema mean if you have a little less of that pushing back against the past and pushing forward into the future?
Yeah, that's definitely a really good one. Yeah, and there has been a ton of, I guess, people are really saying like Crowley said some horrible things about certain races, said some horrible things about women. I mean, he said like people are really starting to look back. And while that happens, also people are still trying to keep it in context. But what do you just make of a lot of the push against Crowley?
Well, I think, Crowley's a complex topic and a complex person. There's a lot of sides to him and his story. And some of those sides are, in fact, unsavory. But at the same time, I also think that you're looking at someone, again, over the course of his lifetime, who wrote a lot of things and whose opinions and positions changed. And sometimes they could change within the same day, depending on whether he was signing something per Durabo, Aleister Crowley, or the Master Therion. Each of those represented kind of a unique and distinct point of view in his magical consciousness. And I think it becomes very easy to cherry pick quotes and say, look, wasn't Crowley a horrible person? Or, oh, look, wasn't Crowley a very enlightened person? And you can find evidence for all those positions. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know, I look at Crowley and his attraction and his advocacy of, again, the remarkable women of his time, the people who were trying to push the envelope of women in society, that, when he advocates, the idea of free love, like at the Abbey of Thelema or whatever, this wasn't a one-sided thing where I get to sleep wherever I want.
Right.
But like, you get to too. And in fact, if you don't, I kind of wonder what's going on there.
Right.
So it was very much he was very egalitarian in that aspect, that he thought that all people, not just dudes, but men and women should be able to love who they will, when and where they will. And in many ways, that's not only a empowerment of both of the sexes, but it's also an empowerment for the whole LGBT spectrum. And as well as kind of reacting against the caste system such that it exists in British society in his time. He pretty unequivocally states in various places that the law of Thelema is for everyone, and that everyone should be able to live according, to their nature, their true nature. And that's not bounded by any restrictions, based on race or sexuality or anything. So, I don't know. It's again, I think it's easy to pick and choose little quotes out of context to make your argument. But I think, Crowley's, his more inclusive and enlightened views are also worth keeping in mind.
For sure. I think what comes off the more you read about Crowley was just, he's a human being, right? Like he's just a guy as well, an exceptional person, but also just a person, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of his diaries, like during the J-Flu period, I mean, he was writing string out on coke too, it's like,
yeah.
And not surprising there's crazy stuff in there,
Absolutely. The Life of Crowley, it reads like one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. No matter which biography you read of him, there's not a boring one. They're all great. Is there a story of Crowley that you feel encapsulates the man?
I've got a lot of favorite stories about Crowley, and for me personally, I think it's when he's being a little bit more playful or puckish. A lot of people kind of, see Crowley as being this, evil, satanic, spooky bogeyman, black magician, and whether you're, super conservative or you're an edgelord, there's this thing about Crowley, and Crowley has had a great sense of humor, and I really appreciate that about him, perhaps more than anything. So I think it kind of puts things into perspective. It doesn't mean, there's a quote from John Cleese I often come back to, is that too many people mistake being serious for being somber, meaning you can be very serious and still have a great sense of humor.
Right.
But in terms of a story, rather than a story from Crowley's life, I come back to a newspaper story about Crowley. And if I could, because I came prepared with this just in case.
Wonderful.
I'd like to read just the beginning of this. And this is the newspaper article that introduced Crowley to America when he arrived on Halloween in October 1914.
Nice.
Where is it? Oh, here we go. Okay. So this is a bit written by reporter Henry Hall for the New York World Sunday magazine.
Amazing.
One man to whom I spoke of him lauded Crowley as a poet of rare delicacy, the author of Hail Mary, a garland of verses in honor of the Mother of God. Another alluded to him as an unsparing critic of American literature. Another knew him as the holder of some world records for mountain climbing. Still another warned me against him as a thoroughly bad man, a Satanist or devil worshiper steeped in black magic, the high priest of Beelzebub. An actor knew of him only as a theatrical producer and as the designer of extraordinary stage costumes. A publisher told me that Crowley was an essayist and philosopher whose books, nearly all privately issued, were masterpieces of modern printing. By others, he was variously pictured to me as a big game hunter, as a gambler, as an editor, as an explorer. Some said that he was a man of real attainments, others that he was a faker. All agreed that he was extraordinary.
Richard, that's fantastic. For myself, I also like the very puckish side of Crowley, and I'm not going to tell the story because it has to do with while he was at Boleskine, and it involves haggis.
Oh, yes.
I'm not going to share the story because I want everybody to grab Richard's Perdurabo, because the way that Richard puts it is so wonderful, and it actually had me laughing out loud because it's such a fantastic story. But please, everybody, if you want the most comprehensive biography of Crowley, you have to grab Perdurabo. Richard, what do you have next? What's going on for you? You still have your foot in the or finger in the Crowley pie? What's happening here? Is there something happening?
Yeah. I mean, I had done so much research for Perdurabo, I had things left over, and that kind of led to other projects like my book Forgotten Templars on the origins of OTO, and Panic in Detroit and some other stuff. But next month, fingers crossed, I should have coming out a edited and introduced, basically a critical edition of Aleister Crowley's book, The Sword of Song,
okay,
which in many ways was his first magical book, in terms of its design and content. And I go back and I compare that to its two different published versions as a standalone volume in his collected works, but also in terms of his marginal notes and also his early manuscripts and typescripts. And I also go through and just decipher a lot of not only the Kabbalistic riddles and conundrums, but also just the many, many references to things, current events that have been kind of lost to the sands of time. So it will make this book a more readable and understandable volume. And it was originally only published in 100 copies. So this will be a good chance for people to kind of be able to grab this book in a much more user-friendly format. Wonderful.
Where can people find your work, Richard?
A good place to go would be at my website, which would be richard-kaczynski.com. Also, though, my books are available through Amazon.com and largely through your favorite bookseller. You mentioned the Wiser Concise Guide and Perdurabo. Both of those should be available through whatever bookseller that you prefer.
I will have links to Richard's website and links to the specific books that Richard has put out about Aleister Crowley. Those will be available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also at whatmagicisthis.com, there's going to be other show notes there. They're going to be a little bit slight. I'm going to save the brunt of the Aleister Crowley links for the very last episode. That's going to be a solo episode done by yours truly. So wait for that. But if you just Google Aleister Crowley, there's so much stuff. You can find just tons of great resources out there. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find links to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I'm pretty active on the Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Not so much. I'm trying to get a little bit better at them, but yes, that's all I'll say about that. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend, and perhaps if your friend enjoys it, they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend, and that's how this word of mouth thing kind of happens. I love it. I don't do a ton of promotion for my podcast. I tend to rely on the good word of others, and that's the best. I think the whole word of mouth thing, that's my jam. So if you enjoy it, please tell a friend. Also, if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review for me on iTunes or Stitcher or any of the places that you can leave a review. Much appreciated. I know the star click thing, that's all well and good, but if you want to write a few sentences or even just one sentence about how much you enjoy What Magic Is This, particularly on iTunes, that would be great. People do read those reviews, and every once in a while they'll be like, you know what, I want to check this show out. So the more reviews you leave me, the better. But if you really enjoy the show, please leave a review. If you really, really enjoy the show and you think that I'm doing some pretty good work here on What Magic Is This, then perhaps you might enjoy joining the Patreon. This podcast is basically my job. It is what I do for a living. I love it, and I think I'm doing something pretty important. And if you feel like you can support the show, please do. It's only $7 a month. That is it. And when you join, you get access to exclusive episodes. Those are full episodes that I make, just like the regular podcast. Full episodes that are in the Patreon content. I do things about certain entities, spirits. I've got a series on Goetia and Grimoires. I did an episode about Baphomet. I've done an episode on Hermenubis. I did a video on Saint Expedite, and I also did a video recently about how to make your own incense. But that is only available if you join the Patreon. Again, $7 a month. That is all I am asking. You get access to all of that, as well as access to a Discord server. We have a wonderful community, a bunch of great people there, people that are new to magic, people that are old hat at magic, and it's a wonderful, supportive group of people. Not a bad word said on there. Just we all try to support each other because, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? Right. So if you think that I'm doing a good job with What Magic Is This, I would love your support. That can be found at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to What Magic Is This and find any one of the Patreon buttons. They're all over the place there. So please find that. And hope to see you there. If you enjoy the show, but you don't really feel like doing the whole Patreon thing, I have a PayPal Me account on whatmagicisthis.com. Just click on any one of the PayPal buttons, click that, and donate to the show. Each and every one of those donations, they go straight to keeping this podcast alive, for hosting the website, for the podcast itself, and the internet that I have to pay to get the best quality internet to make sure that my connection is great so I can talk to these people from all over the world. And that's basically what the PayPal money goes towards. But unfortunately, you don't get any of the wonderful content, that good old Patreon content that's only available on the Patreon. So $7, all I'm going to say, $7 a month, and you get access to all the good stuff. But otherwise, PayPal Me is the place to go. But all of those things are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Fantastic, Richard. I'm so happy to have had you on here. And I can't think of a better podcast that went through the life of Crowley. I mean, we missed so much, man. Like there's
Yeah, we went for nearly 2 hours here, and we still scratched the surface.
Oh my goodness. The people do have podcasts literally only about Aleister Crowley for this reason, because there's just too much stuff. But I think we got down to the pith of the man. Hopefully we got to the good stuff. So Richard, thank you so much for joining me. I hope if sometime in the future, if I would ask you to come back on the show, you would, because I had a great time.
This was wonderful, and I thank you for the opportunity. I had a great time, and I hope your listeners enjoy it.
I'm sure they will. So that's the show, everybody. That's the life and ideas of Aleister Crowley. And tune back in. We're going to be talking a bit more about Aleister Crowley for the rest of the month, at least 2 more episodes after this one. But until then, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.